My name is Elijah Dixon, though most folks just call me Eli. I am 74 years old now and still live in the same small corner of Mississippi where I was born, Willow Creek. The air here smells of soil and iron, two things that shaped my entire life. I grew up the second of 5 children in a wooden farmhouse my father built with his own hands. We had a cornfield that glowed gold in summer and a stove that burned day and night through the winter. When the frost came, it painted our windows white, and we'd wake before dawn with our breath hanging in the cold air, ready to help with the chores. Life was never easy, but it had rhythm, honesty, and warmth. My father, Robert Dixon, was a farmer who believed a man's word was his signature. My mother, Soledad, ran the home with the patience of a saint. She cooked collard greens and catfish that would melt in your mouth and kept us children in line with nothing more than a steady look. There was Marcus, Curtis, Tanisha, Chantel, and me, the stubborn one who always wanted to make something with his hands. School was a tiny building about 2 miles from home. I never made it past the 4th grade. The teacher knew that when harvest came, we'd be in the fields instead of the classroom, and nobody judged us for it. Around the age of 9, something happened that changed the course of my life forever. One day, Daddy took me to a local machine shop owned by a man named Frank Powell. The moment I stepped inside, I was struck by the heat, the clang of metal, and the sharp scent of coal and sweat. Sparks flew from the forge like fireflies, and Mr. Powell stood there, hammer in hand, bending steel as if it were alive. I remember whispering, "That's what I want to do, Daddy." He smiled. "Then you'll have to work for it, boy." And work I did. By the time I was 14, I was sweeping the floors of that same shop after school. At first, my job was just to stoke the fire and polish the tools. But Mr. Powell saw something in me. He began teaching me how to read the color of heated metal, how to listen for the tone that tells you steel is ready to bend. "Steel's like people," he used to say. "You gotta know when it's soft and when it'll break." Those words stuck with me for life. Our town was small but proud. People came to Mr. Powell for everything: farm plows, hinges, horseshoes. On weekends, he'd invite me to his house for supper. His wife, Miss Helen, served ribs, macaroni, and peach cobbler. She treated me like one of her own children. I think Mr. Powell saw me as the son he never had. When I was 17, a flood struck Willow Creek. The muddy water swallowed fields, homes, and barns. Mr. Powell's shop was under 5 feet of water, and I spent 2 weeks helping him salvage what little was left. When it was over, he put a heavy hand on my shoulder and said, "Eli, you ain't my apprentice anymore. You're my partner." That day, I felt 10 feet tall. But the following year, fate tested me. One morning, while we were working at the forge, Mr. Powell stumbled, dropped his hammer, and fell. His face went pale. I called for help, but by the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. I buried him with a piece of forged iron I made myself, shaped like a flame, for the fire that had burned in him his whole life. After the funeral, Miss Helen called me to her house. "Frank wanted you to have the shop," she said. "He always said you were the one who'd keep it alive." She let me buy it little by little, paying her whenever I could. I was 19, just a boy by most measures. But from that day on, I became the blacksmith of Willow Creek. My father told me, "Son, every man's got to follow his fire. Yours burns in the forge." And he was right. I spent my days working metal, my nights sketching designs by the light of a single lamp. The clang of the hammer became the heartbeat of my life. Sometimes I think back to that moment. A barefoot boy in a cold wooden house, staring at the sparks flying from the anvil. I didn't know it then, but that was the first chapter of the story that would define me. The story of a man who built his life out of heat, sweat, and trust. Trust. That word would later come to haunt me. But for now, I was young, strong, and full of hope, with no idea how heavy a heart can become when that trust is broken. By the time I reached 21, the forge was my kingdom. I could read metal the way other men read faces. Farmers came to me with broken plows and worn-out hinges, and I sent them home with something stronger than before. The sound of my hammer became part of the air of Willow Creek, ringing from dawn until sunset. Then came the day she walked into my life. It was spring of 1972. I remember the sunlight pouring through the shop's dusty windows, slicing through the smoke like golden threads. She stepped inside holding a small brass school bell cracked down the side. "Are you the welder?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. "Yes, ma'am." "That's me. Eli Dixon," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "You don't need to call me sir. I ain't that old." She laughed, a bright, musical laugh that filled the shop more than the sound of any hammer ever could. Her name was Grace Miller. She had come from Memphis to teach at the local elementary school. Her hair was long and dark, her skin smooth as copper, and her eyes carried that calm intelligence that makes you want to listen before you speak. I fixed her bell that same afternoon, polished it until it gleamed. When she came to pick it up, I gathered my courage. "There's a place on the corner called T's Grill," I said. "Best coffee in the county. Maybe you'd like to try it." She hesitated for half a heartbeat, then smiled. "I'd like that." That was the beginning. Grace was unlike anyone I had ever met. The women around here talked about recipes and weather. Grace talked about books, music, and faraway cities. But she never looked down on me. She listened, truly listened, when I spoke about iron and fire, about the beauty of turning raw steel into something useful. She said it was art, though I never thought of it that way. We started meeting every weekend. Sometimes we'd walk along the creek. Other times we'd sit on the porch of her rented house and talk until the fireflies came out. I told her about my dream of expanding the workshop one day. She told me about the children she taught, about how some of them came to school barefoot, carrying their notebooks in paper bags. We shared a simple kind of hope, the hope of building something lasting. Her parents didn't like me at first. They thought their educated daughter deserved more than a man who spent his days covered in soot. Grace told them, "I didn't choose money. I chose a man who builds things." Over time, they came to see what she saw, that I was steady, respectful, and meant every promise I made. 2 years passed like a heartbeat. In autumn of 1974, I bought a modest ring from a jeweler in Jackson and took Grace to the gazebo park near the edge of town. The trees were turning gold, and the pond mirrored the sky. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the ring, but she caught it before it fell and whispered, "Yes," before I even asked the question. We married in January the next year at the First AME Zion Church. It was a small ceremony, but the whole town came. Afterward, we celebrated at the community center: barbecue ribs, potato salad, cold beer, and a local band playing old blues tunes. I still remember the way she looked that night in her simple white dress, laughing under the string lights. Our honeymoon was just 3 days in Nashville. I couldn't keep the shop closed longer, but she never complained. "We'll have our adventures later," she said. "Right now, we build our life." And that's what we did. We rented a little house near my forge. She taught school. I worked late into the evenings. Sometimes she'd bring me supper in a lunch pail and sit by the door reading while I hammered away. When I finally put down my tools, we'd share cornbread and sweet tea, our faces glowing in the forge light. By the time I turned 26, we bought a small piece of land on the edge of town. Everyone said it was too far out, but Grace said she liked the peace and the sound of crickets at night. I built the workshop first, a tin-roofed shed with a coal forge and a hand-painted sign that read, "Dixon Metal Works." After that, We began the house. Every brick, every nail passed through my hands. Grace painted the walls herself, humming gospel songs as she worked. We had no money for fancy furniture, but we didn't care. The kitchen smelled like coffee and sawdust, and our evenings were filled with laughter. We'd sit on the porch, watching the stars rise above the dark fields. She'd talk about her students. I'd tell her about the jobs I finished, and we'd dream of the future. When work slowed, I made little things for her: an iron candle holder, a set of hooks shaped like leaves, a garden gate with her initials woven into the design. She said, "I built beauty from fire, but what I really built was our life together." Those were the golden years, before age, before doubt, before silence crept in. Back then, every morning felt like the start of something new, and every night ended with her head resting on my shoulder, the smell of iron and lavender between us. I didn't know it then, but those moments were the ones I would replay in my mind decades later, searching for the point where everything began to change. For now, though, I was just a young man, newly married, with calloused hands and a heart full of fire. Our first years together were years of hard work and quiet joy. The world beyond Willow Creek could have fallen apart, and we would not have noticed. All that mattered was the rhythm of the hammer and the steady sound of Grace's voice reading by lamplight. By the time I was 27, the forge had grown louder. Orders came from farms across the county. People wanted custom gates, tools, and wagon frames. Grace helped me with the numbers, keeping track of costs and clients. She was sharper with a pencil than I ever could be with steel. I often told her, "You could run a business on your own." She'd smile and answer, "I already do. Yours." In those years we talked about children, though money was still tight. I wanted to give her more before we brought a child into the world. But life doesn't wait for perfect timing. One spring morning she came to the shop, her eyes bright and hands trembling. "Eli," she said softly, "we're going to be parents." I stood frozen, then laughed until tears ran down my face. We spent the next months preparing. I built a cradle out of mesquite wood with iron curls on the sides. Grace sewed little blankets and painted the nursery in warm yellow. When our son was born, in early May of 1980, I was 29, and felt both young and ancient at the same time. We named him Jamal. He was small, strong, and loud, lungs like a trumpet. I held him against my chest and whispered, "You'll never know hunger, boy. Not while I breathe." Grace smiled from the hospital bed, her face pale but peaceful. Those first nights at home were a blur of crying, rocking, and feeding, but they were the happiest chaos I'd ever known. Grace took a break from teaching, and I worked twice as hard. The shop became more than a forge. It was a promise. I hired 2 young helpers, taught them the trade, and built a reputation that spread beyond Willow Creek. Folks began calling my work Dixon Strong. I liked the sound of that. 3 years later, when Grace told me she was expecting again, I was calmer. We knew what to expect, how to juggle nights without sleep and days full of noise. Jamal was just old enough to understand that he was about to become a big brother. He walked around the house practicing how to hold a baby using one of Grace's pillows. Our daughter arrived in winter of 1984. We named her Zoe, a name Grace chose from a book of poetry she loved. She was tiny and perfect, with her mother's eyes and a laugh that could melt stone. The house filled with new sounds, 2 children running, Grace singing to them, and me hammering at the forge. The place that once felt too big for 2 people soon overflowed with life. Toys on the floor, jam on the table, and drawings taped to the walls. Grace used to say, "It's not a mess, it's proof that we're living." The business kept growing. By the early 90s, Dixon Metalworks had 5 workers, and orders coming from far beyond our county. Jamal, still a boy, already liked to hang around the shop. I'd give him a small hammer and scraps of iron to play with. Zoe preferred books, sitting in a corner of the workshop reading while the sparks flew. Grace watched them both with pride. We were not rich, but we were respected. In Willow Creek, reputation is everything. People knew us as the Dixons, the steady couple who worked hard, raised polite children, and showed up at church every Sunday. Grace became a pillar of the local school, later promoted to principal. I built the school's new gate myself as a gift, curling the initials W and C into the design. On weekends, our yard turned into a meeting place. My brothers brought their families. My sisters came with dishes of food, and Grace made her famous sweet tea. I grilled ribs and told old stories. We had laughter, music, and the kind of peace you only understand after decades of struggle. In the mid-90s, heavy rain struck again. The creek overflowed, flooding parts of town. My workshop went under. I remember standing waist-deep in muddy water, trying to save what I could, while Grace stood on the porch, shouting directions, and Jamal hauled tools beside me. We lost machines, but not hope. The community helped us rebuild. That flood taught me what real partnership was. Grace never complained, never blamed. She organized donations at the school, wrote letters, and kept me going when I wanted to give up. "You forged this business once," she said. "You can forge it again." And we did. Within a year, the shop stood taller, stronger, and higher on new foundations. Time passed. Jamal finished high school and decided to study engineering. When he told me, I felt something swell inside me, pride mixed with disbelief. A boy who once hammered nails beside me was now going to learn the science behind what I did by instinct. Zoe followed Grace's path, excelling in literature. At 50, I thought life had reached its peak. The business was steady. The children were grown. Grace and I celebrated 25 years of marriage with a small party in our garden. She wore a blue dress that matched the twilight, and when we danced, I could almost believe we were still the same young couple who had built a home out of dreams and dust. We stood there under the old oak tree, surrounded by family, laughter, and the smell of roasted meat. I remember whispering to her, "We did it, Grace." She smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. "Yes, Eli," she said softly. "We built everything we dreamed of." I did not know it then, but that night marked the high point of our lives, the calm before the first crack in the steel. The years that followed were gentle ones, or so they seemed. By the time I was in my early 50s, the house no longer echoed with the sound of running children, but with the calm hum of a well-lived life. Jamal had finished his studies and come back from Atlanta full of new ideas. He wanted to bring modern methods into the shop, computer drafting, precise measurements, laser cutters. I still trusted the weight of my hammer more than any machine, but I let him lead. "The world is changing, Dad," he told me. "Let's change with it." So Dixon Metal Works became Dixon Metal Works and Fabrication, a name longer than the building itself. Orders doubled. We built gates for estates as far as Georgia, railings for Memphis hotels, and even custom art pieces for architects who had never set foot in Willow Creek. I let Jamal handle the paperwork while I stayed close to the fire. The smell of hot iron was still the smell of home to me. Zoe entered the University of Memphis to study literature, traveling every day by bus rather than moving to the city. "I like the quiet of Willow Creek," she told me. "It helps me think." Grace helped her edit essays late into the night. I would find them both asleep at the kitchen table, heads resting on open books, the lamp burning low. In those years, Grace shone more than ever. She had become principal of the local school, the first black woman in the county to hold that position. The entire town respected her. Children greeted her on the street. Parents brought her pies and flowers in thanks. At church, people would say, "That Dixon woman, she's a blessing." I believed it too. She was my pride. When Jamal married Nicole, a young woman from Jackson, Grace planned the entire wedding herself. It was held in the community center, with blue ribbons, gospel music, and so much food that tables sagged under the weight. I remember watching my son dance with his bride, his face full of hope, and thinking, we've done our job well. 2 years later, our first grandchild arrived, a little girl named Kyra. Holding her felt like holding time itself. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and I thought about how my father once held me the same way. Grace wept, calling Kira our little sunshine. She spoiled that child without shame, bringing toys, cookies, and hugs, enough to drown the world. Then came Isaiah, a boy with Jamal's eyes and my stubborn jaw. Grace made him a baby quilt embroidered with iron gray thread. She said it matched my work. The house came alive again with the sounds of children's feet and laughter. On weekends, they would visit, and I'd pull Kira around the yard in a wooden wagon I built myself, while Isaiah banged on pots pretending to be a drummer. Zoe, meanwhile, started teaching English at the same school where Grace was principal. To see them together, mother and daughter, working side by side, filled me with pride. I'd stop by the school sometimes just to bring them lunch, pretending it was an errand, when really I just wanted to see their smiles. By the time Grace turned 60, she began talking about retirement. "I've given the best years of my life to this school," she said one evening, sitting on the porch swing. "Maybe it's time to let the next generation lead." I agreed. "You've earned your rest." When the day finally came, the school held a surprise celebration. Former students returned with their own children. They gave speeches, sang songs, and cried tears of gratitude. Grace stood there with flowers in her arms and shining eyes. I had never seen her so loved. That night, I told her, "You've changed more lives than any sermon ever could." She laughed softly and said, "And you've built more than any preacher ever blessed." We spent the next years in peace. She tended to her garden, reading in the afternoons under the magnolia tree, while I went to the shop to tinker and tell stories to the younger workers. Sometimes we traveled: Nashville, Savannah, New Orleans. We saw the Mississippi River from different towns and ate our way through roadside diners. Every trip ended with her saying, "There's no place like home," and me agreeing completely. Our life seemed settled, steady as the anvil itself. But time, I learned, does its work slowly. Small cracks appear before a beam breaks. It began with tiny changes. Grace, once content to spend evenings at home, started joining new groups: a knitting circle on Tuesdays, volunteer work on Thursdays, book club on Saturdays. It sounded harmless, even healthy. I was proud she had found ways to stay busy. "Good for you," I said. "You've earned some time for yourself." She smiled and kissed my forehead. "It's important to keep the mind alive, Eli." But weeks later, little inconsistencies began to surface. One day, I mentioned her book club to our neighbor, Miss Gloria, who also attended. She looked puzzled. "No meeting yesterday, Mr. Eli. We canceled because Teresa's been ill." When I asked Grace about it, she brushed it off. "I must have mixed up the days," she said, avoiding my eyes. Another time she came home with a new dress, more modern, more daring than her usual style. When I complimented her, she seemed uneasy. "Oh, the church ladies made me buy it. It was on sale," she said quickly, tucking it deep into the closet. I noticed she started visiting the salon more often. She began coloring her hair, using new perfumes, and checking her reflection longer than before. When I teased her about it, she said, Now that I'm retired, I've got time to look presentable. It might have ended there, just vanity born from age. But then came the phone, that little glowing thing that never left her side. She had never cared for it much before. Now she carried it everywhere, even to the bathroom. Once, late at night, I woke to find the bed empty. I went to the kitchen and found her in the dark, typing on her phone. "Who you writing, Grace?" I asked. She jumped, startled. "Oh, Eli, it's Zoe." She couldn't sleep. The next morning, I asked Zoe, half joking, "You keeping your mama up all night texting?" She frowned. "No, Daddy. I was asleep early." I told myself it was nothing. After 45 years of marriage, I believed trust was stronger than suspicion. Still, a quiet unease began to live inside me, like a faint ringing in the ears you can't make stop. I didn't yet know that this was the sound of steel beginning to crack. The year turned, and life in Willow Creek went on with its usual calm. I spent my days at the shop. Jamal handled the orders, and Grace filled her weeks with her new activities. To anyone else, she looked like a retired woman keeping busy. But I began to see the pattern hiding behind the schedule. It was January when she announced that she had joined a computer class in Memphis. "I don't want to be one of those grandmas who can't send an email," she said with a bright laugh. "It's twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'll take the early bus." I admired her spirit, even teased her. "You, on a computer? The woman who still writes grocery lists on the back of envelopes." She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said, "You'll see, Eli. I'll surprise you." At first, I thought nothing of it. I drove her to the bus station some mornings, watched her wave through the window, and felt proud that she still had energy to learn new things. But weeks passed, and something in my gut began to turn. It started when an old friend, Willie, called me from Memphis. He had seen me once at the station and wanted to catch up. During our talk, I mentioned Grace's classes. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What computer class?" "My Dolores takes all the senior programs in town, and she hasn't heard of any class like that." I laughed it off, but the words stuck like a splinter under my skin. That night, when Grace was asleep, I opened her purse and looked for notebooks or handouts. Anything from this so-called class. There was nothing. No papers. No schedules. No notes. Only a lipstick, some receipts, and a folded church program. I felt ashamed for snooping, but my mind wouldn't rest. The next week, I told her my back was hurting and I couldn't drive her. "No problem," she said easily. "I'll catch the bus right here in town." That morning, I asked Jamal to take me in his truck. "We'll follow at a distance," I told him. He looked puzzled, but didn't argue. We watched her get on the bus to Memphis, then drove after it, keeping far enough behind to go unnoticed. She got off near downtown and walked into a small cafe instead of any school. I saw her sit at a table by the window. A man joined her, gray-haired, well-dressed, around her age. They greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek, then talked for nearly 2 hours. My heart sank, but I said nothing. Jamal glanced at me. "You want me to go over there, Dad?" "No," I said quietly. "Let's go." I spent the ride home staring out the window, the noise of the engine filling the silence. My mind fought itself, half of me trying to believe it was innocent, the other half already knowing better. When she returned that evening, I acted normal. I asked about the class. She told me what they'd learned that day, explaining in detail about typing exercises and email lessons. Every word was practiced, smooth, almost rehearsed. I nodded, pretending to listen, while my stomach turned. The next months brought more signs. She became livelier after each class, humming while she cooked, wearing new perfume, even buying me small gifts. "Saw this and thought of you," she'd say, handing me a new wrench or a tin of my favorite pipe tobacco. It felt like she was buying peace. Then, in March, she told me she had joined a senior women's travel group. "We're going to Nashville next month," she said. 3 days. All ladies, no husbands. I laughed, though it hurt a little. "And leave me here to starve?" "You'll survive on canned chili," she teased. She sent photos during the trip, museums, old churches, smiling faces of other women. Everything looked perfectly normal. But when she came home, I noticed a new necklace around her neck, silver with a delicate pendant. "The ladies bought it for me as a souvenir," she said quickly when she caught me looking. 2 months later came another trip, this time to Savannah. I asked for the organizer's contact number, just in case of emergencies. She hesitated, but finally wrote down a name and phone number. When I called, a kind woman confirmed the trip and wished Grace a good time. Later, I found out she was a friend of Grace's who had agreed to play along. The group began to travel every few months: Nashville, Savannah, Charleston. After each return, she looked both radiant and far away, like part of her had stayed wherever she'd gone. Our talks became shorter. Our dinners grew quieter. She would spend evenings on her phone, smiling at messages she wouldn't show me. That Christmas, the air in the house was heavy. The children came. The grandkids ran around. But something invisible stood between us. Grace sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, smiling to herself. Jamal noticed. He gave me a look, the kind of look a son gives when he knows something's wrong but doesn't want to say it. After everyone left, I asked her softly, "You happy, Grace?" She looked at me, startled, then forced a smile. "Of course I am. Why wouldn't I be?" I wanted to believe her, but there was a distance in her eyes that no lie could hide. In February, we reached our 45th anniversary. I planned a dinner in Memphis. Flowers, wine, soft music. She seemed touched, even held my hand across the table. "It's been 45 wonderful years," she said. But the way she said, "been," past tense, made my heart tighten. A month later, the call came from my nephew. Curtis, my brother, had fallen ill. I planned to drive to Memphis to visit him. Grace said she couldn't come. Church duties, she claimed. I packed my bag and went to bed thinking only about my brother. At dawn, the phone rang again. Curtis had been admitted to the hospital. No visitors allowed for a few days. I hung up and sat there in the dark. And that's when the idea came. I would pretend to go anyway, pretend to travel, to leave the house empty. Then I would return that evening and surprise her. Part of me wanted it to be romantic, a sweet old gesture to spark what had gone cold. But another part of me, the part that had been watching and waiting, wanted truth. It was the kind of plan a man makes when his heart is already halfway broken. That morning, I loaded my suitcase, kissed her on the cheek, and said I'd see her in a week. She wished me a safe trip, smiling the same easy smile I'd once loved. I got in the truck and drove away, not toward Memphis, but toward the place where all lies eventually lead. Home. The morning of that Wednesday felt ordinary. The sun was low and pale over Willow Creek, the air cool and still. Grace made coffee, folded my shirts into the suitcase, and reminded me not to forget my blood pressure pills. Nothing in her voice hinted at deceit. She even slipped a slice of sweet potato pie into a tin. "For Curtis," she said. "He always loved it." I hugged her, kissed her cheek, and walked out the door with the weight of a lie in my hands. "See you next Tuesday," I said. She waved from the porch, small and calm, framed by the house we'd built brick by brick. I started the engine and drove down the dirt road, watching her figure shrink in the rearview mirror. But I didn't drive far. I turned off near the old feed store, parked, and waited until I was sure she couldn't see me. Then I made my way to the shop, the one place I could hide without raising suspicion. Jamal was there working on a railing. "Didn't expect you, Dad," he said, surprised. I decided to stay back a few days, I answered. Just wanted to surprise your mama later. I didn't tell him the truth. Not yet. I spent the morning pretending to help, though my hands trembled on every tool. At noon, I ate at Mr. Earl's diner, the same seat I'd sat in for 30 years. I ordered chili and cornbread but couldn't taste a thing. Every tick of the clock sounded like a countdown. Around 3, I bought flowers and a bottle of wine. Grace's favorite kind, the one we used to drink on anniversaries. Then I drove home, parking a block away so no one would hear the engine. I walked quietly through the back gate, the March sun warm on my neck, the smell of jasmine thick in the air. The house was silent. "Grace?" I called softly. No answer. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Strange. Wednesdays were her television nights. The blinds were drawn, the rooms neat. I checked the bedroom, everything in its place. The bathroom counter looked different, a few of her creams and makeup missing. Maybe she'd gone to a friend's. I told myself that. I waited. 5 o'clock came, then 6. The sun slid behind the trees, and shadows stretched across the floor. Still nothing. I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called Zoe. "Honey, have you heard from your mother today?" "No, Daddy. I thought you were on your trip. Is everything okay?" I lied. "Just calling to check in. I can't reach her, that's all." I hung up and called a few of Grace's friends. Most didn't answer. The ones who did sounded uneasy, their voices too careful. One said she hadn't seen Grace since church. Another said, "Maybe she's resting, Mr. Eli. You know how women are." But I could tell by the silence after their words. They were hiding something. By 8 that evening, worry turned to panic. I drove to the sheriff's office. Officer Miller, an old acquaintance, listened patiently. "Mr. Dixon, it hasn't even been a full day," he said. "She's a responsible lady. I'm sure she'll turn up soon." I went home and sat in the armchair all night, staring at the door. The clock ticked through the dark hours. I prayed, cursed, prayed again. Morning came. The bed was still untouched. I poured myself black coffee and remembered something. Her notepad. Grace always kept a small paper pad near her checkbook where she wrote appointments and reminders. I found it in the kitchen drawer and flipped through the pages. On the week's calendar, one word stood out in her careful handwriting. Art. Nothing else. Just art. I turned more pages. The name appeared again and again, always on the same days she claimed to have activities in Memphis or meetings with her travel group. Art, the man from the cafe. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. On the back cover of the notepad, a phone number was scrawled in pencil. I dialed it from the landline, my hand shaking. On the third ring, a deep male voice answered. "Hello?" I froze. "Who's this?" he asked again, a bit sharper. I hung up. The sound of that voice confirmed what my heart already knew. I stood there, staring at the silent phone, the air thick with betrayal. I couldn't sit still. I called Jamal and told him to drive me to Memphis. He didn't ask questions, just saw the look on my face and obeyed. We drove for hours, checking hotels one by one. At each front desk, I showed a photo of Grace. Most shook their heads. Some looked uneasy, but said nothing. At the 10th hotel, a small, quiet place on the north side, the young woman at the desk hesitated when she saw the photo. "Did she check in as Grace Dixon?" I asked. She frowned, typed something, then shook her head. "No record." But her eyes said otherwise. "Please," I whispered. "She's my wife. I just need to know she's all right." The girl glanced around, lowered her voice. "There's a woman who looks like her, but she's registered as Grace Miller. Checked in yesterday with a gentleman. Room 214. Grace Miller, her maiden name. Words sharp enough to cut through bone. Is she here now? They left earlier but haven't checked out. I think they'll be back. I thanked her and stepped outside. My legs felt heavy. Jamal watched me from the truck, confusion written all over his face. Dad, what's going on? Go on home, son, I said. I'll handle it. He didn't argue. When his taillights vanished, I crossed the street and entered a small cafe facing the hotel. I ordered coffee and waited. The cup went cold, untouched. The clock crawled past noon. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. At 3:30, a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Her car. I watched her get out of the passenger side, smiling, radiant, lighter than I'd seen her in years. A man stepped out of the driver's seat. Tall, silver hair, neat clothes, the same man from the cafe. He placed a hand on her waist as they walked inside together. Something inside me broke, clean and final, like metal under too much pressure. I waited another hour. My thoughts felt like smoke, thick and suffocating. Finally, I stood, left a few bills on the counter, and crossed the street. The receptionist looked up as I entered. Recognition flickered in her eyes. She nodded toward the stairs. "They're still in," she whispered. I climbed slowly, step after step, until I reached room 214. My heart pounded so loud I thought they might hear it. I raised my hand and knocked. Silence. Then, faint voices inside. A laugh, her laugh. "Arthur, you are impossible," she said. Arthur. Art. The sound of that name finished what little hope I had left. I knocked again, harder. The voices stopped. Footsteps approached. The door opened. And there she was, my wife of 45 years, standing in a blouse I'd never seen, her hair loose, her face a map of shock and guilt. "Eli," she gasped. What are you doing here? Can I come in?" Her lips parted, no sound coming out. Then she stepped aside. I walked into the room, the smell of perfume and betrayal thick in the air. Near the window stood the man I'd seen before. Older than me, well-dressed, uneasy. He looked from her to me and back again, his face drained of color. "So, this is it," I said quietly. "All the trips, all the classes, all the lies." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Eli, please, I can explain." "No," I said. "I think you already have." Grace stood frozen by the door while I looked around the room. 2 suitcases sat half open beside the bed, clothes folded neat as if this was some honeymoon trip. A half-empty bottle of wine on the table. 2 glasses. A world that had existed right beside mine, hidden in plain sight. The man near the window cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "Mr. Dixon, I know this looks terrible, but..." I cut him off. "You don't owe me explanations. She does." Grace pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Eli, please sit down." "I'll stand," I said. My voice came out calm, too calm. The kind of calm that comes after the last spark has burned out. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then she said quietly, "Eli, this is Arthur." I gathered that. They exchanged a glance. Shame, fear, and something else. Something I couldn't read. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked. "You both look like you're hiding a bigger sin than the one I already caught you in." Arthur's shoulders sagged. Because until a few weeks ago, I believed Grace was a widow. The word hit me like a hammer. A widow? Grace met my eyes. "Yes, Eli. I told him you were gone. I told everyone here you had died 2 years ago." For a second, the room blurred. I couldn't breathe. "You killed me." "It was easier that way," she said, the words trembling but steady enough to pierce. "When I met Arthur at a teacher's retirement conference in Memphis, I didn't mean for anything to happen. We talked, had coffee. I enjoyed his company. It felt harmless at first. But when it grew serious, I couldn't tell him the truth. So I said I was a widow. that you died suddenly of a heart attack." Arthur's face twisted in disbelief. "Grace, you told me he died in Savannah, that he collapsed during a trip." She nodded, tears spilling down. "It was a lie, all of it. I made it up." I felt sick. "And what did you tell him about your life back home? The house, the children, everything?" "That I had moved on, that I was living quietly." "Quietly," I repeated, "while sleeping beside me for 45 years. Arthur turned to me. "Mr. Dixon, please believe me. I had no idea. If I had known she was still married, I'd have never—" I held up a hand. "I believe you. You were fooled, same as me." Grace sobbed, clutching the edge of the bed. "Eli, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then what did you want?" I asked. She lifted her head slowly, and for the first time I saw something hard behind her tears, a kind of defiance. "I wanted something of my own. For decades I took care of everyone, the children, the school, you. My life was built around serving others. When I retired, I looked around and realized I didn't know who I was anymore. Arthur saw me differently, not as a mother or a wife or a principal, just as Grace. And that gave you the right to erase me from existence?" Her voice turned sharp. "A divorce in Willow Creek would have destroyed everything. People would talk. The children would take sides. My name would be dragged through gossip for years. So yes, I chose another way. Here, in Memphis, I could live free of judgment. I could be Grace Miller again." "The best of both worlds," I said bitterly. "Respect in Willow Creek, romance in Memphis." She didn't answer. Arthur looked at her, pain plain on his face. "Grace, you lied to me too. I believed every word you said. You made me mourn a man who was still breathing." She covered her face and cried. "I thought I could keep both lives apart forever. I didn't expect them to collide." I stared at the two of them, the woman who had once been my heart, and the stranger who shared her bed. 45 years of marriage dissolved into a single ugly truth. She had built a second life by burying me alive in imagination. "How long?" I asked. Arthur answered for her, "Since September of 2017. We met at that conference. We saw each other once or twice a month at first, then more often." Grace nodded silently. "So when you told me you were taking computer classes, book clubs, church trips—" "All of it was Arthur," she whispered. "Every trip, every class, every excuse." I looked around again. A purse on the nightstand, her reading glasses, a folded church brochure from Memphis, evidence of a false world built with care. "And our children?" I asked. "Do they know their mother's dead in this version of life?" She looked horrified. "Of course not. They think I'm doing all those activities. No one in Willow Creek knows. Only here, I'm a widow." Arthur spoke again, quieter now. "My children met her once. They believed she'd lost her husband years ago. They pitied her. The absurdity of it hit me all at once. 2 families, 2 stories, one lie connecting them both." I laughed, a harsh sound that made Grace flinch. "So you built a shrine to my memory while I was still paying the electric bill." She tried to reach for my hand. "Eli, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I pulled away. "You never meant it, but you kept doing it. Year after year." "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered again. "You didn't want to be caught," I said. "That's the truth." Her shoulders slumped. She stopped crying. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy as smoke. Then she looked up with a strange calm. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I just wanted freedom, and I was too much of a coward to ask for it honestly." There it was, the last spark of the woman I once knew, stripped of excuses. I turned to Arthur. "I'm sorry you were dragged into this." He nodded. I'll be ending this tonight. You have my word. I faced Grace again. I don't know who you are anymore. You used to, she said softly. No, I answered. I only thought I did. I walked to the door, each step heavier than the one before. Grace called my name once, then again. But I didn't turn. I left the hotel and stepped into the bright Memphis sunlight that suddenly felt cold. The street noise blurred around me. Horns, voices, the hum of life that no longer felt like mine. I walked to the bus station, clutching nothing but the car keys I had taken from her purse without thinking. I didn't drive. I couldn't. I sat on the bench until the next bus to Willow Creek arrived, staring at my reflection in the glass, a dead man riding home to his own grave. I rode the bus back to Willow Creek in silence, my hands folded around the keys that still smelled faintly of her perfume. The window reflected a stranger's face, older, smaller, hollowed by disbelief. I tried to think, but thoughts wouldn't stay still. Every image of our life together, our wedding day, the children's laughter, the porch swings at sunset, now looked like someone else's memory. When I reached home, the house felt colder than it ever had before. Everything was just as I'd left it that morning. The half-drunk cup of coffee, the folded newspaper, the groceries for the surprise dinner sitting forgotten on the counter. Only the silence had changed. It wasn't peace anymore. It was absence. I moved through the rooms like a man walking through a museum of his own life. In our bedroom, her pillow was still dented. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a long time. Then something inside me broke quietly, without sound. I packed a small suitcase, just enough for a few days, and left the rest. I couldn't sleep under that roof, not while her ghost, the woman who had buried me alive in imagination, still hung in the air. Jamal lived just a few blocks away. When I knocked on his door, he opened it with a smile that vanished the moment he saw my face. "Dad? What happened?" "Let me come in," I said. We sat in his kitchen. I told him everything, the lies, the man, the hotel. He listened without interrupting, his hands clenched on the table, his jaw tight. When I finished, he just shook his head slowly. "No, that can't be right. Mom wouldn't. She couldn't. I saw it, son." He stood and paced the kitchen, running a hand through his hair. "There has to be some mistake. Maybe she—" "There's no maybe," I said, my voice sharper than I meant, then softer. "I wish there was." He dropped back into the chair, eyes wet. "She's been lying to all of us." The next morning, Zoe came over after Jamal called her. She didn't cry at first. She just sat staring at the table like she was waiting for someone to say it was a joke. But when I handed her the notepad, the pages marked with art, and the hotel address written in Grace's handwriting, her breath hitched. "Why would she do that?" she whispered. "She had everything." I had no answer. For 3 days we didn't hear from Grace. The children called her phone, left messages, sent texts. No response. On the 4th evening, I heard her car in the driveway. Jamal was with me. He wanted to stay. She stepped inside as if nothing had happened, hair tied back, eyes red but dry. When she saw Jamal, she froze. He spoke first. "Mom, where were you?" She set down her purse. I needed time to think. "Think about what?" I asked. "Which life you plan to keep living?" She flinched, then tried to speak, but Jamal's voice cracked through hers. "How could you, Mom? To him? To us?" Her hands trembled. I made a mistake. "Mistake?" he shouted. "A mistake is burning dinner." This was years of lies. Zoe arrived not long after. The 4 of us stood in the living room, the same room that had once held Christmas mornings and laughter, now turned into a courtroom. Grace tried to talk, but every sentence fell apart. She said she never stopped loving us, that she only wanted something just for herself. Jamal turned away. Zoe cried silently, her shoulders shaking. When Grace reached for her, Zoe stepped back. You lied to everyone, Mama. You even killed Daddy in your story. What kind of love is that? I wanted to defend her, out of habit, but the words wouldn't come. I watched the woman I'd once believed was my other half crumble in front of our children. And I realized forgiveness was a language none of us could speak that night. She left after midnight. No suitcase, just her car keys, and whatever pride she could still carry. I didn't follow. The next week, I went to the courthouse and filed for divorce. At 69 years old, I stood in front of a clerk and signed away nearly half a century of marriage with a single pen stroke. The papers didn't hurt as much as I expected. By then, the pain had already done its work. Word spread fast. In Willow Creek, secrets last about as long as morning fog. People whispered in the diner, in the church, at the hardware store. Old Eli's wife ran off. Can you believe she led 2 lives? Bless his heart. Pity. That was worse than betrayal. I'd rather they hated me than pitied me. Jamal and Zoe did their best to shield me. They came by often, brought the grandchildren, tried to fill the space she left. But every object in the house carried her mark. The curtains she'd sewn, the scent of lavender in the closets, the picture of our wedding still hanging above the fireplace. I couldn't live among ghosts. I rented a small place near the shop. 1 bedroom, 1 chair, 1 coffee mug. Enough. I told myself I'd stay there only until the storm passed. But storms like this don't pass. They carve new landscapes. Grace sold her share of the house and moved to Memphis. I later learned she bought an apartment there, small and tidy, not far from the university. Arthur was gone. She'd ended that. Or maybe he had. Either way, her new life didn't include me or the town that remembered our names, carved side by side on the church's donor plaque. We stopped talking, except through the children. Jamal told me she still called sometimes, mostly to ask about the grandkids. Zoe said she sounded lonely. I never asked for details. I didn't want to know who she was now. Sunday dinners disappeared. Holidays turned quiet. Birthdays became 2 separate celebrations. The family that once fit around one table now lived in halves. Her side and mine, never together again. I learned to fill the silence. I worked more hours at the shop, took extra jobs just to stay busy. Some nights, when the forge burned late, I would catch myself humming her favorite hymn, and I'd stop, angry that the tune still lived in me. Yet time, relentless as rust, softened even that anger. By the next year, I no longer woke every morning expecting to hear her voice. The pain didn't vanish, but it became dull, like an old scar you learn to live with. I told myself that forgiveness wasn't for her, but for me, a way to keep the heart from turning to stone. I didn't forgive the lie, but I forgave the years that followed it. They were mine again, unshared, unbroken. 5 years passed. I was 74 now, with a few more lines on my face and fewer dreams, but still standing. I saw my grandchildren grow taller, my son's business thrive, my daughter's students adore her. I kept the rhythm of work and rest, the same way a blacksmith keeps his hammer steady long after the fire has cooled. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, I'd sit by the window and think about the forge, how steel bends under heat, but still holds shape if you strike it right. People aren't so different. You can break them, burn them, twist them, but somehow they find a way to shine again. The years that followed were quieter than I ever imagined life could be. The forge became my refuge. I arrived before sunrise, when the air was still cool and the light crept through the windows in narrow gold lines. The smell of coal and iron greeted me like an old friend. There was rhythm again, not the rhythm of youth, but the slow, steady beat of survival. pain changes shape over time. At first, it's a blade, sharp, cutting through everything you touch. Then it dulls into a weight, something you carry without thinking. After a while, it becomes a shadow that walks beside you, no longer an enemy, but a reminder. I learned to live with that shadow. Grace and I didn't speak for almost 2 years. The first time she reached out was through a letter, handwritten, neat, like every note she ever gave her students. It arrived on a warm April morning, tucked among bills and catalogs. The return address was Memphis. My hands shook as I opened it. She wrote that she wasn't asking for forgiveness, only understanding. She said she was sorry for the lies, for the double life, for the hurt she caused. She claimed to have ended things with Arthur and was living alone, volunteering at a literacy program for seniors. She wrote, "I will never ask you to forget, but I hope you'll remember that before all this, there was love. Real love. I know I buried it under shame, but it existed. It still does." I didn't write back, not then. I read her words until the paper softened from use, then locked it in the drawer of my workbench. Forgiveness, I told myself, is not a door you can open when someone knocks. It's a door that opens from the inside, and only when the heart is ready. Mine wasn't. Jamal and Zoe stopped mentioning her name after a while. It was an unspoken agreement. We'd moved past it. Still, I saw traces of her everywhere. Kyra had her smile, Isaiah her stubborn streak. Sometimes when they came to visit, I caught myself using Grace's old phrases. "Wash your hands before you touch that. Don't talk with your mouth full." The words came naturally, like echoes of a ghost who refused to leave. One summer afternoon, I was working on a gate for a new client when Zoe walked into the shop. She looked uneasy, holding her phone. "Daddy," she said softly. "Mama had a mild stroke." I stopped what I was doing. For a second, I couldn't breathe. "Is she?" "She's stable. Recovering at the hospital in Memphis. Jamal's there." That night, I sat in my truck for a long time outside the shop. The key was in the ignition, but I didn't turn it. Pride wrestled with compassion, grief with duty. Finally, I started the engine. The road to Memphis felt shorter this time. When I entered her hospital room, she was asleep. The machine beside her beeped steadily. Her hair had gone completely silver, her face thinner, her hands fragile as paper. I stood there, not knowing if I was supposed to feel anger or sorrow. In the end, I felt both, and neither. When she woke and saw me, she didn't speak at first. Tears filled her eyes. "You came," she whispered. "I did," I said. She tried to smile, the way she used to after long arguments, but the effort tired her. "You look the same," she said weakly. "I doubt that," I replied. Silence stretched between us, filled with everything we didn't say. Then she murmured, "Eli, I never stopped being sorry." "I know," I said. "But you did stop being mine." She nodded slowly. "I did, and I've paid for it every day." I sat down beside her bed. "You don't owe me penance, Grace. Just peace. For both of us." Her hand trembled as she reached for mine. I let her hold it. For the first time in years, it didn't hurt. We sat like that a while, not as husband and wife, not as enemies, just two old souls who had shared a life and lost it. A week later, she was discharged. Before I left, she pressed something into my palm, her wedding ring. "Keep it," she said. "I can't carry it anymore." I kept it in my pocket for days, unable to throw it away. Finally, one evening, I melted it in the forge. The gold softened under the heat until it turned liquid, a small glowing sun in the crucible. I poured it into a mold shaped like a dove, a symbol of release. When it cooled, I placed it on the shelf above my workbench, a piece of the past reborn into something peaceful. Months, turned into years. Grace and I never lived together again, but sometimes she'd send cards for the children's birthdays, for Christmas, once even for mine. Each one ended with the same line: "May your heart stay warm and your fire never fade." I remarried once, briefly, to a widow named Lorraine, who came to the shop to commission a gate for her farm. She was kind and patient, but I think she sensed that part of me was already taken by memory. We shared 3 good years before she passed quietly in her sleep. I mourned her too, but in a different way, with gratitude instead of regret. As I grew older, people in town began calling me Old Iron. They said I'd been through fire and come out stronger. I smiled at that, though strength often just means surviving when you'd rather not. Sometimes I visit the churchyard where my parents rest. There's a bench nearby, shaded by an oak. I sit there and think about all that time gave and took. I no longer hate Grace. In truth, I understand her more now than I did when the wound was fresh. Loneliness is its own kind of hunger, and even the best people can starve quietly. I forgave her at last one autumn evening. I didn't call or write, just whispered her name while the forge hissed beside me, and let the smoke carry it away. The next day, I felt lighter, as if the air itself had changed. Now, when young couples come to my shop asking me to build gates or wedding arches, I tell them something simple. Steel remembers how it's treated. Heat it too fast and it warps. Strike it too hard and it cracks. But treat it steady. Give it time to breathe, and it'll outlast the storm. They usually smile, not realizing I'm talking about love, not metal. And when they leave, I turn back to the fire, feeling its warmth on my hands. After all these years, the forge still answers me with its steady breath, proof that some fires, once lit, never truly die. The last time I saw Grace alive was on a cold February morning. She was living in a small assisted apartment near the hospital where she volunteered. Zoe called me that week, her voice hesitant. "Mama's been feeling weak again," she said. "She'd like to see you." For a long time, I stared at the phone in silence. The last visit had brought peace, not closeness, and I thought that was enough. But when someone who once shared half your life asks for your presence near the end, you go. You don't think, you just go. I drove up to Memphis. The city felt different now. Quieter, older, or maybe I was. Her building was simple, brick walls and narrow halls that smelled of coffee and medicine. When I knocked, she called, "Come in." Her voice faint but still familiar. Grace was sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket, her silver hair catching the light like frost. She looked smaller, almost translucent, as though the years had been sanding her down grain by grain. Still, when she smiled, I saw the young woman who had once walked into my forge, carrying a broken brass bell. "You came," she said softly. "I did," I answered, setting down the bag of groceries I'd brought. She reached for my hand, the skin thin as paper, but warm. "You look tired," she said. "I work too much. You always did." We talked for hours about the children, the grandchildren, the shop, even the weather. Ordinary things, safe things. Then, when the light began to fade, she said quietly, "I've been writing something. For you." She handed me an envelope sealed with tape. "Don't open it here," she said. "Wait until I'm gone." I wanted to protest, but her eyes stopped me. They carried the calm of a person who had already made peace with the end. "I'm not sure I can handle another goodbye," I said. "You already have," she whispered. When I left, she followed me to the door, holding the frame for support. "Eli," she said, "I'm grateful you came. I didn't deserve it, but I'm grateful." I touched her cheek. "We were young once," I said. "We did our best." She smiled. "Sometimes the best still breaks. That was the last time." 2 weeks later, Zoe called again. "Daddy," she said, and her voice cracked. "Mama's gone." I sat down slowly, the world narrowing to a hum. "When?" "Last night. Peacefully. In her sleep. Peacefully." The word carried both comfort and weight. The funeral was small. Grace had left instructions. No big service, no speeches. Just family, a few close friends, hymns, and sunlight if the day allowed. The church was the same one where we'd married nearly 50 years earlier. The same worn pews, the same tall windows. When the pastor spoke her name, I felt something deep inside me shift. Not grief exactly, but release. She had lived many lives, and now all of them had ended in one quiet breath. I stood near her casket after the others left, tracing the grain of the wood with my fingers. "Goodbye, Grace," I said. "You were fire and storm and home, and I loved you, even when I couldn't anymore." That evening, back at my house, I remembered the envelope she'd given me. I set it on the table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and opened it. Inside was a folded letter written in her careful script. "Eli, if you are reading this, I have gone where no lie can follow me. I've spent the last years trying to make peace with the woman I became and the man I betrayed. I don't ask for forgiveness, only that you understand why I broke. When I met Arthur, I was tired of being perfect. People looked at me and saw a symbol, the principal, the wife of the blacksmith, the good woman who did everything right. But inside, I was hollow. He didn't fill that emptiness, Eli. He only reminded me it existed. The truth is, you never failed me. You were steady, kind, and honest. But I lost myself somewhere between raising children and keeping up appearances. I thought I could build two lives and keep them apart. But lies are bridges that burn both shores. I want you to know that even in my sin, a part of me always loved you. The sound of your hammer, the smell of your shirts, the way you said my name when the day was long, those things never left me. You were my home, even when I walked away from it. If there is any mercy left in your heart, remember me not as the woman who lied, but as the girl who once believed in you completely, the one who brought you a broken bell and watched you fix it with fire. Keep your forge burning, Eli. It suits you. It always did. Grace. I read the letter twice, then a third time, until the words blurred. The bitterness that had followed me for years finally began to fade, replaced by something softer. Not forgiveness exactly, more like understanding. That night, I walked to the forge and lit the fire, the air filled with the familiar hiss of heat meeting metal. I set the letter on the workbench, and for a long moment, I just watched the flames dance. Then I picked up a small brass bell, the same one I had repaired for her nearly half a century earlier. The crack still faintly visible, but the sound still clear. I struck it once. The tone echoed through the shop, clean and pure. She was gone, but the echo remained. The next morning, I buried her letter beneath the magnolia tree behind my house, the same spot where she used to read on summer afternoons. I marked it with a small stone and no words. For days afterward, I found myself listening for her voice in the wind, her laughter in the rustle of leaves. Maybe it was memory, maybe something beyond. I didn't question it. Some things aren't meant to be understood, only felt. Life moved on. The forge still burned. The grandchildren still ran through the yard. But now there was a gentleness to it all, a sense that the story had finally reached its quiet closing chapter. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch, watching the sky fade to gold, and think about how strange it is, how love can survive truth, and truth can survive love, and both can live in the same heart without tearing it apart. Grace was gone, but the lesson she left behind stayed, that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, it just teaches you to breathe again. The years after Grace's death passed slowly, but not without meaning. I was an old man by then, and the forge had grown quieter. The younger workers took over most of the heavy jobs while I stayed near the back, polishing tools, giving advice, or simply sitting with a cup of coffee watching sparks fly. The world had changed. Machines now did what once required muscle and instinct. Still, people came to me for the small things, the work that needed a human touch, the kind no machine could feel. I kept her brass bell on the shelf near my workbench. Sometimes, when the shop fell silent, I'd ring it softly and listen to its sound fade through the air. It reminded me that even broken things could sing. The grandchildren grew fast. Kira turned 16, Isaiah 13. They liked to visit the shop after school, mostly for the soda I kept hidden in the back fridge. But sometimes they'd watch me work. Kira said the fire looked alive, like it breathed. Isaiah was curious about every tool. "Did Grandpa make this hammer?" he'd ask. I'd smile. "Your daddy did, with his own hands, just like mine before him." I taught them both the basics, how to hold a hammer, how to strike steady, how to listen for the tone of metal. "It'll talk to you if you pay attention," I told them. Everything does. People, metal, even silence. They laughed, thinking I was being poetic, but I meant it. The older I got, the more I realized how much truth hides in quiet things. On Sundays, we still gathered for dinner, though the family table had grown smaller. Jamal sat at one end, Zoe at the other, their children between them. We never spoke much about Grace, but sometimes her name slipped into conversation, like sunlight through clouds. Kira once asked, "Grandma was a teacher, right?" I nodded. The best there ever was. That was all I said. The rest she could learn when she was older, if she needed to. Children should inherit love, not pain. I lived alone, but I was never truly lonely. The forge was company enough. The steady rhythm of hammer and fire filled the space that once belonged to conversation. At night, I'd walk through the yard where I'd buried her letter, the magnolia branches whispering above me. Every spring it bloomed brighter, as if trying to make up for lost years. One morning, I woke before dawn and felt something different. Not pain, but a kind of stillness inside me. The world seemed softer, the air lighter. I brewed coffee, sat by the window, and thought about how far I'd come from that barefoot boy in Willow Creek who fell in love with the sound of steel. My hands were scarred and stiff, but steady. My heart, though cracked, still held heat. That afternoon, I started writing, not a letter, but a story. My story. I wanted the grandchildren to know more than dates and names. I wanted them to know what life really teaches you after the noise dies down. I wrote about the forge, about Grace, about the flood that nearly ended the business, and about the night I discovered her lie. I didn't hide the pain, but I didn't curse it either. I wanted them to see that love can fail without being false, that good people make terrible mistakes, and that forgiveness is the hardest, most necessary craft of all. I called the pages "The Fire Remembers." It took me 6 months to finish. When I was done, I sealed it in a brown envelope and gave it to Zoe. "For the kids," I said. "Not yet. When they're ready." She didn't ask questions, just nodded. She knew that look in my eyes, the one that meant something had reached its end. After that, I slowed down. The doctor told me my heart wasn't as strong as it used to be. "You need rest," he said. I smiled. Rest is for the cold. He didn't understand that a man who spends his life by the fire can't live too long in stillness. So I kept going. Slower, maybe, but steady. In autumn, Jamal insisted we take a family photo. All of us together. The 4th generation of Dixons. We stood in front of the workshop, the old anvil behind us. I held Isaiah's shoulder. Zoe held Kira's. The camera clicked, and for a moment, I saw the echo of everything we'd been. Grace's smile in Kira's face, my father's stance in Jamal's frame, my own reflection in the glint of the steel sign above us. Dixon Metalworks, Estrard 1975. That evening, when the family left, I stayed behind to clean the shop. The forge was cooling down, its orange glow fading. I sat on the stool, elbows on my knees, and whispered to the empty room, "We did all right, didn't we?" The only answer was the soft crackle of cooling embers, but I took that as agreement. As winter approached, my strength began to fade. The hammer grew heavy, the air colder. I knew the time was near. I wasn't afraid. I'd lived long enough to see how endings can be gentle if you let them come on their own. On my last working day, I forged one final piece, a small cross made from leftover scrap steel. Simple, strong, without polish. I stamped the initials ED on the base and set it beside the brass dove I'd cast from Grace's ring. Fire and gold, side by side. Past and peace. That night, I locked the shop for the last time. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of rain. I walked home slowly, each step echoing the weight and wonder of a full life. Before bed, I took out Grace's brass bell. I rang it once more, listening to its clear note fade into the dark. "Good night," I said to no one, or maybe to everyone who had ever loved me. Then I turned off the light. The morning Eli Dixon did not wake. The sun rose exactly as it always had, soft, gold, and steady over Willow Creek. The town stirred, roosters crowed, the forge stood quiet, its chimney cold for the first time in half a century. Zoe was the one who found him. She had come by early to bring breakfast, as she sometimes did on Fridays. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was still. Eli sat in his armchair by the window, glasses on, a book open in his lap. His head rested slightly to one side, his face calm. The light caught on the silver strands of his beard, and there was the faintest trace of a smile. The kind a man wears when he knows the fire has gone out, but leaves behind enough warmth to keep others alive. The doctor said it was peaceful. Heart failure in his sleep. No pain. Just rest. The kind he had always refused while alive. The family gathered within hours. Jamal arrived first, his shoulders squared like his father's. Then Zoe with the grandchildren. Kira stood by the window, looking at the empty forge across the yard, and whispered. Grandpa's fire went out. Jamal placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it just moved somewhere else." That evening, when they unlocked the workshop, the air still smelled faintly of smoke and oil. On the workbench lay two objects, the steel cross and the brass dove, side by side. Beside them, a folded note written in Eli's careful hand. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't mourn too long. The fire doesn't die when the hand that feeds it rests. It passes on. Keep it burning, but don't let it blind you. Remember that steel is only strong because it has known the flame." At the bottom, he had written, "Tell the kids I'm proud of them. Tell Grace I understand. Tell the fire thank you." They buried him next to the magnolia tree, not far from where he had buried her letter years before. The blossoms had begun to fall, white petals covering the ground like soft snow. Jamal placed the steel cross at the head of the grave. Zoe set the brass dove beside it. Fire and gold, forged and melted. Husband and wife. The funeral was small, much like Grace's had been. Old friends came, men who had worked beside him in the early years, students Grace had taught long ago, neighbors who still remembered the young couple who once danced under string lights in the community hall. When the service ended, Jamal stood before the crowd and spoke. My father built his life from heat and honesty. He taught us that metal remembers how it's treated, and so do people. He wasn't perfect, but he was true. And in a world that bends easy, he stayed strong. Later that week, Zoe brought home the envelope Eli had left for her years before. The fire remembers. She gathered the family and read it aloud in the living room. His words filled the space, steady and plain, telling the story of a man who loved, lost, forgave, and kept going. By the time she finished, there were no tears left to shed. Only quiet respect. Kira asked if she could keep the brass bell from the forge. It was Grandma's, she said. Zoe handed it to her. Then it should stay in the family. That night, the girl walked into the darkened workshop, stood by the cold anvil, and rang the bell once. The clear tone echoed through the room, the same sound that had once marked beginnings, endings, and everything between. In the weeks that followed, Jamal decided to reopen the forge. He kept the old name, Dixon Metal Works. The town helped clean, repair, and repaint. On the day it reopened, the first thing he forged wasn't for a customer, but for himself. A gate for the Magnolia Yard, with 2 intertwined letters worked into the iron, E and G. When the sun hit it just right, the metal shimmered like fire. Years rolled on. The shop passed to Isaiah, then to his daughter after him. The old tools stayed. The anvil still bore the mark of Eli's hammer. And though the machines grew modern and the world moved faster, one thing remained unchanged. Every morning, before starting the forge, the Dixons would ring the brass bell once. Some said it was tradition. Others said it was respect. But the family knew it was a conversation, a way of saying, we're still here. And maybe, somewhere beyond the reach of years, the man who had learned to read the color of heat and the patience of silence smiled once more, hearing the echo of his own lesson ringing back to him across time. Steel, he had said, remembers how it's treated. So does love. The fire never truly dies. It only waits, in hands that remember how to keep it alive.